I wonder, you said that Putin is not just stalling the negotiations for time, but it does kind of seem that way because I think I'm struggling to understand what are the Russians waiting for? Because it doesn't seem like that Trump would be giving Russia anything more than what they're already getting or what they were perhaps promised. And it's not like if the Russians would just wait it out for a few more months, they would conquer Ukraine. And probably if the war continues for a few more months, it would look very much the same as it does today. And as you said, you only risk making Trump angry for wasting time because you can probably only stretch this for a certain period of time before the negotiations fall apart. So, what do you think is the Russian thinking behind that?
I think their view is that this is a historic opportunity and it's more than just about Ukraine. And we had a clue about this when Witkoff was recently speaking about his meetings with Putin in St. Petersburg. And he said, oh, it's about talking about 5 regions, which are the 5 regions of Ukraine that Russia has annexed. And I think it's fair to say that although the Russians would love to see their control extended to the full oblast, the regional boundaries of these regions that they have entirely illegally annexed. I find it hard to believe that even they believe that Ukraine would actually withdraw and hand over this territory, especially because it includes cities like Kherson, like Zaporizhia. Um, so in some ways, I think that's what they're setting up as their concession. We demand X, but X is entirely unreachable. But then, as our big concession, we will say, okay, we won't have X after all. But the point is, Witkoff also said, but there are so many other moving parts. There's NATO, there's Article 5 and such like. I think this is the point from the Russians' point of view. This is a chance not just simply to try and make a deal over Ukraine, but actually to normalize relations, at least with the United States, to see entire or partial sanctions relief, and maybe also to actually find some opportunity to re-engineer the security architecture of Europe. Because the point is, this is going with the grain of the Trump administration. The Trump administration is not going to pull out of NATO, in my opinion, not least because that actually would require full congressional approval. And there are enough Republicans who are still supporters of NATO that's not going to happen. But on the other hand, Trump is clearly unwilling to commit America to securing Europe. He regards the Europeans as essentially sort of freeloaders who, while, in his view, screwing the United States over trade, are also screwing it over security. So I think in those circumstances, Moscow is thinking, well, look, in terms of Ukraine, we're going to keep the territory that we've got now. And it's unlikely to be recognized in international law, not least because that would require a change to the Ukrainian constitution, which takes time and a referendum and everything else. However, what we can do is build up our apparent demands in Ukraine and use those to negotiate some other wider terms. So I think this is the thing. This is why Russia is continuing to talk, continuing to have hopes, but also continuing not to give ground over Ukraine, is because they have this dream that this can be something much, much more dramatic, much, much more expansive. Now, again, the thing is, the risk is precisely you make this too big and too unworkable, and therefore you end up with nothing. But I do think that is the game plan. I mean, and I could obviously be totally wrong, but just simply talking about how Russian pundits and so forth, people who are close to the Kremlin, the sorts of things that they're imagining could happen. I think this is where we're going.
I think one of the reasons why it's so important to talk about this is to understand what are actually the priority for Russia and what would they see as potential victory in coming out of these negotiations. And that's probably really important for the people who are doing that on the American side as well, if they understand that or not. And that would probably influence the outcome. But when you say wider concessions that Russia hopes to get, or people at the top. Do you mean those demands that Russia made before the actual war in Ukraine, and that sometimes every now and then sort of emerge, that we hear Russia still demands, which is basically that NATO withdraws from the entire Eastern Europe, and that the US and Western Europe sort of accepts the entirety of former Eastern Bloc as a Russian sphere of influence? Do you think that Russia still hopes for that? Because I find that very, very unrealistic that that anyone would even conceive of that happening.
I mean, I think it is at once unrealistic and depressingly actual. I mean, I think again, let's stop for a moment and think about the worldviews of the people we're talking about. And one of the striking things is that Trump is not Putin's man, but nonetheless, the two men do share, I think, a common sense of the world in this very 19th century imperialist view that a handful of countries make decisions. And for the rest of the world, the only real question is who owns you, whose sphere of influence or whose colony you are. And we've seen this with this amazing evolving minerals deal that has become much more than just minerals deal that America is trying to impose on Ukraine, which is now essentially a minerals plus infrastructure plus anything else we fancy deal. Again, a very, very colonial way of trying to deal with Ukraine. That sense that, look, because we have supported you, you are now our vassal, you are bought and paid for, and therefore you ought to put up with whatever we impose upon you. And I think likewise, so if you think that the world is really like that, then you can treat it as some kind of grand game of Risk in which you can, move your little counters around and swap countries without having to think about the agency of the countries and the blocs concerned. And I think this is the thing. Again, of course, it cannot happen. I mean, even the slightly light version of the Russian demand, which is essentially just simply that American and other NATO forces withdraw from NATO members in Central Europe, while they still remain part of NATO. I mean, even that is highly unlikely to happen. I mean, monstrously unlikely to happen, I'm glad to say. But nonetheless, again, I think I could imagine Putin thinking that. And in an environment where Putin, just like Trump, is not really someone who can be told when he's wrong by the people around him, that remains part of their ambitions. Now, again, look, it's always difficult because the Russians do have this style, very Soviet, frankly, style of negotiation, in which, ironically, the closer they think they are to a deal, the more aggressive they sound. Because we had, for example, recently Sergei Narishkin, head of the Foreign Intelligence Service, restating the full old maximalist demands of not just the annexed oblasts, but also the sort of quote unquote denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine, etc., etc. I think again, it's hard to know sometimes what's a negotiating position and what is actually a genuine demand, a red line, call it what you will. And I think this is part of the problem because there is a value in that kind of posture right up to the point where you basically price yourself out of any negotiation. Because at the moment, the Russians aren't making clear. I mean, it's not like they're saying, look, this is our A list of things we must have. This is our B list of things we would want and we will argue hard for. These are sort of C list of things we're happy to trade away. We know that they will be those things. And frankly, if I was Iran or North Korea, I would be a little bit worried at the moment because that I may well be on that C list of things they're willing to trade away. But the point is that I think at present, again, because of this mentality that says, oh, if we just push a bit harder, if we bomb another Palm Sunday demonstration, celebration, if we continue to sound so hawkish, oh, who knows quite what goodies we're going to get.
If you're enjoying this podcast, chances are that you like to know what's going on in the world of geopolitics. And if that's the case, you might want to sign up to my newsletter. There's a lot of news on geopolitics, but most of it just doesn't actually matter. It's just chasing headlines, emotions, and breaking news. What I want to do is to try to separate all this noise and find the signal, the stuff that actually does matter and will have consequences months and years down the line. And so in every edition, I pick out 3 things that do matter and explain why and what will be their future impact. You can find the link in the description, so check it out and sign up to stay informed.